Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. Today I'm joined by, I want to call you like my civics homie, because I feel like we just live in this world that like you and I get so excited about a lot of the same things. So today I'm joined by Spencer Burrows. Spencer, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Because you are like a multi-dimensional civic warrior, I feel like.
Liz, with an introduction like that, it's going to be hard to live up. Thanks for having me here, and I appreciate you taking the time. Some of the work that I do, I'm an 11th grade dean at Pacific Ridge School in Carlsbad, California, San Diego County. There, I also teach AP US government and politics, and I'm the civic engagement coordinator. So I do a lot of the civic programming for our school, and I've gotten to collaborate with groups like your own and some of the other larger groups doing this on a nationwide basis to really push forward some of the civic education initiatives that we're trying to push K through 12 and at the college level.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that we've gotten across paths a little bit in the past, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing at ASU.
So today we're going to talk about something called the shadow docket. And this is not in the Constitution, right? The Supreme Court has something called a shadow docket. So today we're going to talk about what it is, how it functions, and why it's become increasingly important, but also kind of a controversial part of the court's work. So, Spencer, we'll start easy. What is the shadow docket?
I think part of this controversy lies in that name, because what we now call the shadow docket for a long time was just referred to as the emergency docket. And I feel like even the term shadow docket, shadow, already has a nefarious connotation to it. And I think that colors a lot of how it's portrayed in the media. So something that I'm sure we're going to get to that I really want to emphasize is I feel like the media plays up the role of the shadow docket in a way that makes it seem even worse for the public than it's already perceived. So I think what people need to know is there's a difference between the shadow/emergency docket and the Supreme Court deciding cases on the merit. And the big difference is when the public thinks about the Supreme Court coming to a decision, that is really cases on the merit. And cases on the merit is the traditional Supreme Court case where oral argument happens probably sometime in the fall. Justices deliberate amongst themselves to reach a conclusion. They draft different opinions. They come to a majority and a dissent probably. Then it's announced somewhere along the line, maybe even in June. The big difference, though, is when we think about the Supreme Court coming to major constitutional decisions or essentially laying down the law in that sense, that is a case on the merits. However, the recent cases we've been hearing coming up on the emergency/shadow docket, the way it's being portrayed seems to have the same effect as the merits. And I feel like the public doesn't make much of a distinction between the two. And for reasons we can delve into in a second, that's problematic, because if the public thinks the Supreme Court is making these big, momentous, merit-type decisions on the quote-unquote shadow docket, it just sounds even worse for the institution than it normally is. And so the purpose of the emergency docket is really prevent irreparable harm by providing temporary relief. And so what that used to be for a long time was, for example, death penalty appeals would come up from the lower courts. It would reach the justices. and they would grant the appeal or deny it, right? That is an immediate question that has to be answered right now.
Mm-hmm.
Or a decision was reached in a lower court like the district court, and the appeal comes up all the way to the Supreme Court saying, well, if whatever issue is being litigated, like maybe the EPA the one that we'll talk about in a moment, Supreme Court, you need to stay this ruling or hold this ruling for a moment because there's going to be harm in the meantime by the time the case finally reaches the Supreme Court on the merits, all this harm will have happened in the meantime. Now, we'll go into, I'm sure, why the volume of cases now being seen on emergency/shadow docket has exploded in, let's just say, the last 10 years. But again, if there's anything people take away from listening to this podcast, it's being able to draw the distinction between a case on the merits and a case being decided on the emergency/shadow docket.
And I'm glad that you brought up like things that are immediate, right? Like if somebody is on, awaiting death, that is immediate. That's not something that can wait an entire Supreme Court, like you said, cases starts in October. Like October is when the court starts. They usually end. June is always I call it my Supreme Court season. Monday mornings, I'm up, I have my cup of coffee, I'm ready to hear. Why do you think the shadow docket then has become, and again, it does sound very nefarious. Like now I'm like, is this a secret? Like, why is this the way it is? But why has it become more prominent and controversial like recently? Because it does feel like all of the sudden it has become this like thing.
I think there's a couple of reasons. And to be honest, I'm parroting a lot of things that have been discussed out there, floating in the ether. But one thing would be the increased uses of executive orders on the part of the president. The last, I would say, 15 years, presidents, plural, have been using executive order more and more. And those actions oftentimes are the ones that are somehow reaching the Supreme Court. So that's one end. States more and more have been the litigant in cases, and it's often appeals from actions from those states that are then reaching the court. Part of what we can get into, and I do want to relay a conversation I had with some ex-Supreme Court clerks last summer at the Supreme Court Summer Institute. In their opinion, I thought this was a very interesting take because it's not what you usually hear in the media, is that Congress could be regulating a lot of this, and Congress could be setting the rules on how executive orders could be carried out, or at least a formality. Congress probably could regulate to a degree state standing and how that flows forward. So there are a number of people who would point towards Congress and be like, Congress, if you just did your job today, you could change some of these rules, and maybe that would lessen, because right now the blame is being put on the Supreme Court. You're hearing all these cases, but like the Supreme Court doesn't seek out cases, right? Cases come to the Supreme Court. So there are some justices on the court, both as would be construed the liberal justices or the conservative justices, who are all saying, Congress, you need to start fixing the system. Like we don't control the system. We decide cases in front of us. But to put it bluntly, executive orders, if those were lessened in volume, and if there were changes to how states had standing to bring suit on certain issues, those two things I think would affect the volume of shadow docket cases. In addition, there was a case last summer, Trump v. Casa, that for most intents and purposes put a stay on nationwide moratoriums. And you might remember from both the Biden administration and then even earlier in the second term of the Trump administration, there were district court judges that were putting nationwide moratoriums on a policy or an action. And it was those moratoriums that were often getting shot all the way to the Supreme Court. And so in Trump v. Casa, the court came down and said, maybe we shouldn't go too far into the details because it is quite long. I would encourage people to look up the full opinion. But they said for most intents and purposes, we're not going to be doing these nationwide injunctions. That's not a workable system. So the fact that now that's not happening, will that decrease the number of shadow docket cases? Maybe.
I'm glad you brought up Street Law Supreme Court Institute because you are an alumni. I am an alumni. It is probably one of it, not probably, that is incorrect. It is one of the best professional developments I've ever been to because you get to talk to ex-clerks, you get to be in court. Like we got to talk to a Supreme Court justice. It's so interesting. And I'm glad that you guys talked about this. So, what are the biggest concerns that critics might be raising about transparency and accountability when it comes to these shadow docket decisions?
I think we first need to look at the context in which the Supreme Court operates. And if you look at the three branches, the Supreme Court, I think for good reason, has always been the least public facing, meaning maybe even today's a bad example, but Congress today is just terminally online. You have members of Congress sounding off constantly on social media and going off on this. You have the president making many announcements online. So like those two branches are constantly out there. The Supreme Court is not, because the intention behind this system hearing a case oral argument in October, deliberating behind closed doors, publishing well thought out written opinions, announcing them in June, you want that deliberative process to happen. And, going all the way back to the Federalist Papers, you want the justices to be able to have those deliberations without public pressure as much as that's possible.
Yes.
So I think we need to start from the position that the Supreme Court has always been, for good reason, the least public facing of all of those. Now you bring in the shadow docket. Well, the shadow docket seems to even do away with the little bit of public facing, like front facing publicity that we used to get with these long written opinions with cases decided on the merits. So now you have shadow docket decisions coming down probably with zero explanation, a quick signed order. Like, I think that would obviously remove any level of transparency that did exist. And again, you keep calling it the shadow docket, like now we've already gone into conspiracy land. So I think where that bothers a lot of people is when some of these orders are coming down, they seem to have the same effect as a case on the merits, even though I don't think that's quite the way to look at it. We can talk about some specific cases in a second, but for example, there's a policy that you as a citizen don't agree with. Well, that policy has now reached the court. The court on shadow docket has allowed the policy to continue as the case is working its way up through the court system. Well, in the immediate, it would seem like they're allowing that policy, like almost like you would on the merits. But that is not the same thing, right? That is not the same thing as Brown v. Board coming down as a decision and setting a rule for everybody forever at all times. Miranda v. Arizona, any of the other big rulings that are now settled law, essentially. To your original question, transparency, now we're getting none of that. And it seems like, according to some, 9 politicians in robes making edicts that they don't explain.
It is really interesting. I think, when we talk about the media, I think one of the things that struck me when I was at the court for the handing down of Whole Woman's Health versus Hellerstedt, which is a case on abortion, very controversial. Outside of the court, there are people protesting, there are people, giving support. It's very loud outside, but then when you go into the court, it is quiet. They are having conversations. And even after Whole Woman's Health was decided, Justice Alito gave a dissent from the bench, and he was clearly not happy with it. But there's no yelling, there's no any of this. And so the Supreme Court, to me, had always seemed like this very deliberative, because when I think of Congress, I think of these big conversations and we're, doing this. And as you were saying too, that they're not very public facing. I was like, I know that members of Congress, the president, members of the executive branch have Twitter, they have Truth Social, whatever social media. I don't think that the 9 justices have. So I know the Supreme Court does as an institution, but they do not, because it is kind of more quiet and deliberate. And, having these conversations. So you had said some things about cases. What are some, you talked about Trump versus Costa. What are some other decisions that were made on the emergency document? So now I'm going to call it the emergency document or docket, because that's what it's called. Shadow docket kind of just came to be from conversations. It's like its nickname, if you will.
Conspiracy land. Yeah, so some of the recent ones, New York Times did a whole expose not long ago talking about West Virginia v. EPA around 2016. And I encourage listeners to go back and they can read the full reporting from the Times, and you can listen to
I will put that
podcast.
in the show notes.
The general gist was that it was during the Obama administration. The EPA had made a broad ruling. The ruling got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court on shadow docket found against the administration. But I think what is, again, causing controversy and just feeding this whole conspiracy rule is that somehow the Times or whoever leaked it got a hold of memos that were between the justices, somewhat revealing their thought process. And again, it's just something we never get to see. We never get to see. So those memos would seem to suggest there was debate within the justices. Should we grant relief? Should we not? This looks bad. Does it not look bad? And the Times seemed to be making the argument like this is the genesis of the shadow docket and the abuses. And maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. But more recently, earlier on with Trump's second administration, the ICE enforcement got in front of the court, Nome v. Vasquez, where on emergency ruling, the justices allowed these ICE enforcement stops to continue. And if you take that as kind of the prime example, if you're someone who doesn't agree with those stops and you see that ruling, I mean, for all intents and purposes, that seems to you like the court is giving a full-throated endorsement of ICE and so on and so forth, when in fact they're letting this case proceed, right? Like nothing was decided on the merits. Come back to that idea. More recently, though, and I thought more interesting, this happened within the last few months. An abortion pill access case got to the court on emergency basis. The question was, district court allowed state of Louisiana to restrict access to the pill. Should it continue? Justice Alito, because that's his circuit, I believe, supported allowing access to the pill to continue. And I think that is a very important distinction because if you're going to play the politics game, Justice Alito is one of the least likely, stereotypically, to endorse any kind of pill access on those ends, but he did, because that was how the case should be proceeding. And that is, I think, a narrative that you're not going to hear in the media, because that seems to cut across this idea that the court is 100% ideological and they, again, 9 politicians in robes. Those were some of the more recent cases. But again, I think, especially with the ICE example, Nome v. Vasquez, because that issue about ICE and ICE enforcement has been so much in the news and the public consciousness, the fact that had to come up on emergency appeal just feeds the fire to that degree.
So what should students and everyday citizens understand about the judiciary that often gets overlooked in kind of our traditional civics education? Because you and I know, because again, we went to this incredible professional development. Like there's so much nuance in it. So for me, I think sometimes it is, the justices are split 6-3 or like split along ideological lines. And I think one of my, besides, oh my gosh, why did it just escape me? Ginsburg and I want to say Nino, but that's not, like, that's what she called him.
Scalia?
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Their relationship, they're on 2 different sides of the spectrum, but kind of one of the lesser known ones is when Justice Ginsburg passed, Justice Thomas, who again is on the complete opposite political side, wrote this beautiful essay about her and about their relationship. So, for me, the Supreme Court is just 9 people who work like they have to work together. They have to see each other, and they're actually people. And so I always like really appreciated that. But what about you? Like, what do you think that people should understand about the judiciary?
I agree with what you said, that you'll hear this very often from the justices themselves, but also people who work in their periphery, like the clerks. Like, they really do agree more than they disagree.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
obviously not the narrative we hear. But if I had any encouragement for people who are really interested in these issues, it's that don't just stop at the reporting from an outlet, whether it be the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or whoever, and it's talking about a particular case.
Mhm.
All of these opinions, all of these writings are available online, like actual court opinions. And yes, it takes a little bit of effort to actually go in and start to read through some of these things. And we apparently live in a post-literate society where reading has just gone out the window. That said, I think people would glean a lot from trying to actually understand what these decisions meant. And even if it's just reading the press release from the court itself, that might give a couple
Mhm.
paragraphs like, this was decided on emergency docket, and this is where it's going from here, right? To understand
Mhm.
the case is still moving up, or maybe they remanded it back to lower court for a different issue. Don't only listen to the naysaying coming from the news sphere. Try to figure out what the actual issue is, because
Mhm.
oftentimes what is actually going on with that case or that decision is not the same as seems to be painted.
And I know that, like, I mean, again, I love reading Supreme Court opinions. I think that it is so interesting because it does put me in a place of what was the law they were looking at, what was the action, and then what did they decide and why. And I have nothing against news media, but at the end of the day, news media is a business, right? They get paid on clicks, on how many people read. And so part of, my way of doing civic literacy for myself is just to go straight to the source and to have that, and again, to understand that at the end of the day, these are people, right? They're deciding things, and sometimes the nuance of what they have to decide is what's important, right? It is not, they're not coming in with their own political opinions on controversial things like abortion. They're actually looking at laws and how they apply and precedents and things like that. And I'm glad that you brought up, like, they actually agree a whole lot more than they disagree. And that's a really cool thing. And I think that that's why, like, for me, the Supreme Court is my favorite branch to study, to look at, because it's so, I don't want to say secretive, but they're not tweeting, they're not throwing things, making reels on Instagram. I think that I would die if I ever saw a justice who did that. Like, that's just not their style.
Agreed. People should go back and look at RBG had a good interview with Stephen Colbert.
Mhm.
Uh,
Oh my gosh.
that
Yes.
it's worth watching. If you haven't seen it, it's worth taking a look at.
Well, and it's so, I mean, and I know that when we talk about civics, Justice Gorsuch and Justice Sotomayor, again, two sides of the political spectrum, but they work together because they believe in civics and they believe in these things. There's so much more that we have in common than what we don't. And I think that really when we get to the Supreme Court, there's so much room for that. Is there anything else we want to make sure our listeners, whether they're students, teachers, or lifelong learners, need to know about the emergency docket or the Supreme Court?
Well, if I could give one last plug for the court, it's that if you get the chance to travel to DC,
Mm.
the Supreme Court building itself is surprisingly accessible. And it's ironic because it's literally across the street from the Capitol building, but you can walk right into the court. If it's the right time of day, you can take a tour.
Mhm.
Sitting in on a case is a little bit harder, but it's almost the forgotten third branch that's just sitting right there. So for all the outsized attention they've gotten, the last 10, 15 years, they're kind of lonely over there.
Yeah, it's such a cool, it's my favorite building. And I like eating in the cafeteria there or like grabbing a cup of coffee or whatever. You never know who you're going to run into. Like I ran into one of the Supreme Court like litigants in there. And I've heard stories from past participants that like a justice will walk in because they need food too. Like this is their place of work. So Spencer, thank you so much for going over the emergency docket with us and kind of talking, I think, lifting the veil a little bit on the Supreme Court. I appreciate it.
Liz, thank you for your time.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.